Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. We contacted a spirit on the Ouija board. Now it's showing up in our videos. Alright, so I never thought I'd be one of those people telling a crazy story like this. But here we are. I guess I should start with some background so you can get a feel for how everything went down. My name's Ryan, and I run a small YouTube channel with my two best friends, Mark and Jess. Our channel isn't anything huge. We do random stuff, kind of a mix between pranks, challenges, and some spooky exploring abandoned places type content. We're not trying to blow up or anything. We just have fun doing it, and a small group of people seem to like our videos. Anyway, this all started about 3 months ago, and I'm still trying to figure out if it's just a string of insane coincidences, or if we really messed up big time. One night we were hanging out at Mark's place after filming one of our exploring videos. We had just come back from an old, rundown farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Nothing major happened during the shoot, just the usual creepy vibes and some creaky floorboards, but it was enough to get us in that spooky mood. So, after a couple of beers, Jess pulled out this old, dusty Ouija board she claimed she found at a garage sale for like $5. None of us are really into that whole supernatural stuff, but I'm not gonna lie, it felt like the perfect thing to mess around with after the day we had. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ryan, Ouija boards are just stupid pieces of cardboard. Why even bother? And yeah, that's what I thought too. But at the time, it seemed like a good way to kill time. Plus, Jess was hyped about it. So we set it up right there on Mark's coffee table. The whole thing started out as a joke. We lit a couple of candles, turned off the lights, and sat around the board, fingers on the planchette. Mark kept making stupid ghost noises like, "Ooh, spirits, come out to play." Jess was cracking up, and honestly, I wasn't taking it seriously either. But after a few minutes, something changed. The planchette moved. At first, I thought it was Jess pushing it to mess with us, but I swear her face went from goofy to straight up pale in seconds. I asked, "Yo, who's moving it?" And everyone said they weren't. Of course, that's exactly what people always say in these situations, but the way it slid across the board, it didn't feel like one of us was doing it. The board started spelling something out. It wasn't just random letters either, it was deliberate. It spelled E-V-A-N. None of us know anyone named Evan, like, at all. We looked at each other, confused, but at the same time, we were all trying to act like it wasn't getting to us. Jess, who usually loves this kind of stuff, looked legit freaked out, but she kept going. She asked the board, "Evan, are you here with us?" The planchette moved to yes. We all kind of laughed nervously, but I could feel the air in the room change. It was heavy, like the temperature dropped a few degrees. Mark, being the skeptic, asked, "How did you die, Evan?" It slid again, faster this time. M-U-R-D-E-R. That's when I started feeling a little weird about the whole thing. But again, I told myself one of them had to be pushing it. Still, there was something about the way that word showed up on the board that just hit different. We asked a few more questions, but the planchette wasn't moving as much anymore. The vibe was completely off by then, so we decided to stop and put the board away. I remember Jess jokingly saying, "Good night, Evan," but her voice was shaky. We left Mark's place not really talking about what just happened, probably because we didn't want to admit we were freaked out over a stupid game. That's when things started getting off. I didn't notice anything weird at first, but the next day, when I went to edit the footage from our farmhouse shoot, there was this static noise in the background that wasn't there before. Like a faint crackling sound that got louder in certain parts of the video. I figured it was just some interference from the camera, or maybe something wrong with my mic, so I didn't think too much of it. I cut out as much of the noise as I could and uploaded the video, but the comments we got, That's when I knew something wasn't right. People started pointing out this shadow in the background of some of the shots, a shadow that none of us saw when we were there. It was small at first, like it could have just been a trick of the light, but as I rewatched the footage, the shadow moved. It wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't any of us. It was like a tall, dark figure in the background of multiple shots. I'm talking almost human-shaped. But there was no one else with us in that house. I freaked out a little, but figured it was just a weird camera glitch, or maybe someone was messing with us in the comments. But then I showed it to Mark and Jess, and they both got super quiet. Mark tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just something in the house we didn't notice at the time. But Jess, she looked spooked. She asked me if I thought it had anything to do with the Ouija board, and I laughed it off, saying no way. But deep down, I started to wonder. That was just the beginning. After that shadow showed up in our farmhouse video, things started getting weirder, but in small, almost subtle ways at first. It wasn't enough for us to freak out about, but enough to keep us on edge. A few nights after the Ouija board thing, we all met up again at Mark's place to film another video. We weren't talking about the board much anymore. I think we were all trying to pretend like it didn't bother us. Jess was acting a little more distant than usual, but she said she was just tired from work. Mark, on the other hand, kept making sarcastic comments like, "Hey, maybe Evan wants to guest star in this one," every time we set up the camera. Classic Mark. The video we were filming was just a casual would you rather challenge. You know, light-hearted stuff to balance out all the creepy content we'd been doing. The filming went smoothly, no issues, no weird vibes, until I got home to start editing. I was halfway through cutting the footage when I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was this brief moment, not even 2 seconds long, where the video glitched. The screen went black, like total darkness, and then this loud, staticky crackling sound blasted through my headphones. It was almost deafening. I jumped back from my computer and ripped my headphones off, my heart racing. I played the clip back, thinking maybe it was just a rendering issue, but the same thing happened again at the exact same spot. I slowed the clip down to try and figure out what the hell was going on. As the video flickered back from the black screen, there was something in the frame that wasn't there before. It was a face. Not a clear face, mind you. More like a blurred, shadowy figure standing behind us, just out of focus. It was only visible for a split second before the footage went back to normal. I paused the video and zoomed in on the figure, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that it was one of us. Maybe Jess had moved around, or it was some weird lighting trick. But no matter how much I stared at it, the figure didn't look right. It didn't look like any of us. It was too tall. And the eyes, or at least what should have been the eyes, were just empty. I immediately called Mark. "Dude, something's wrong with the footage," I told him. I could hear him sigh on the other end, like he thought I was just overreacting. "No, seriously, there's something in it, like a person, but not one of us." He came over to check it out, and when I played it back for him, I could see his expression shift from amusement to unease. "That's creepy," he finally admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "Are you sure Jess didn't move or something?" I shook my head. "Look at it, man. It's not Jess. Look at how tall it is." We sat there staring at the paused frame, both of us trying to come up with some logical explanation, but neither of us had one. Mark, being Mark, shrugged it off after a while. "Maybe it's just a weird camera glitch. I wouldn't worry about it too much." He was trying to play it cool, but I could tell he was as freaked out as I was. I wasn't ready to dismiss it so easily, though. I kept rewatching the clip, over and over again, until the figure started to feel like it was staring back at me. The more I stared, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the way it just stood there, motionless, like it was watching us, like it had been there the whole time and we just didn't see it. Mark eventually got tired of the whole thing and left, telling me to sleep on it. But how could I sleep with that image burned into my mind? I couldn't stop thinking about that name, Evan, that stupid Ouija board session. What if we really did bring something into our lives that night? I stayed up late scrolling through forums, trying to see if anyone else had experienced something similar after using a Ouija board. Most of the stuff I found was vague at best, people claiming they felt haunted or cursed, but nothing that sounded like what we were dealing with. Just as I was about to give up, I came across a post buried deep in one of the paranormal threads. This guy talked about how after using a Ouija board, he started seeing figures in his peripheral vision, dark shapes that would show up in his home or his photos. At first, they were just shadowy, blurry, but over time, they became more distinct. He said the worst part was that they didn't just haunt him in his house. They started showing up in his videos. He described it exactly like what we were experiencing. Glitches, static, and then a shadowy figure in the background that shouldn't be there. The post ended with, "If this happens to you, stop filming. Whatever it is, it feeds off being seen." That sent a chill down my spine. I slammed my laptop shut and tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just some random internet nonsense. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel like I'd just read the future of what was coming for us. The next day, I showed Jess the footage. She didn't say a word at first, just stared at the screen, biting her lip. Finally, she looked at me with this serious expression and said, "Ryan, we need to get rid of that board." We agreed to stop filming for a while, take a break, clear our heads. But as you can probably guess, things didn't get better. They got worse. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound that sent my heart into my throat. My computer, which I had turned off before bed, was on. The screen was glowing in the dark room, and that same staticky crackling was coming from the speakers. I slowly got up, my body tense, and walked over to the desk. The screen was black, but I could still hear the static. As soon as I touched the mouse, the sound cut off, and the screen flickered back to my desktop. I checked the video files. Everything seemed normal. Nothing had been tampered with. But as I turned to head back to bed, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. There, in the reflection of my darkened computer screen, was the figure. The same tall, shadowy figure from the video. It stood behind me, still as death, its empty eyes locked onto mine. I whipped around, my heart slamming in my chest, but there was nothing there. I didn't sleep at all that night. I didn't tell Mark or Jess about what happened that night. I figured they'd either laugh it off or get even more freaked out, and I didn't need that on top of everything else. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, maybe sleep paralysis or something. But deep down, I knew what I saw. That shadow, that figure, it was real. We decided to lay low for a while. No filming, no editing. Just a break from the whole YouTube thing. Mark wasn't thrilled about it, but Jess and I insisted. We needed time to figure out what was happening. The plan was to chill, clear our heads, and get rid of that Ouija board for good. But of course, nothing ever goes as planned. About a week after my late night encounter, Mark texted me out of nowhere. "Dude, check the channel." At first, I was confused. We hadn't posted anything since the farmhouse video, and I was sure no one had access to the account except the three of us. Still, I opened my laptop and logged onto YouTube, expecting to see the same subscriber count, maybe some new comments or something. But then I saw it. There was a new video on the channel. It was titled, "We're Not Alone." The thumbnail was just a black screen, no image, no context. My heart dropped. I hadn't uploaded anything, and I knew Jess wouldn't have done it either. That left Mark. But why would he upload something without telling us? And why that title? I clicked on the video, and what played was, well, it was hard to describe. It started with about 30 seconds of total darkness, like the camera was turned on but no one was filming anything. Then, the static began, that same eerie crackling sound, like someone messing with an old TV antenna. It grew louder, harsher, until it suddenly cut off. That's when the footage appeared. It was a shot of my bedroom. Not a random room, not some spooky abandoned place we'd explored, but my room, my bed, my desk, my posters on the wall, everything. It was taken from the same angle my camera sat when I filmed my solo videos for the channel. Except, I hadn't filmed this. I hadn't filmed anything in weeks. I hadn't even been in front of the camera since the Ouija board night. The camera was shaky, like someone was holding it, but no one was there. The room was empty, and the camera just slowly panned from one side of the room to the other, like it was searching for something. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The footage kept going for another minute or so, showing my empty room, nothing particularly strange, until the camera stopped in front of my closet door. It zoomed in, closer and closer, until the door filled the entire screen. My heart was racing now because I knew where this was going, and I didn't want to see it. The closet door creaked open, slowly, painfully slow. Inside, the light was too dim to make out much, but I could just barely see the outline of clothes hanging on the rack. And then, something moved. A shape, dark and formless at first, shifted at the back of the closet. I leaned in closer to the screen, trying to make sense of it, when the shape stepped forward into the light. It was him, the figure, the one I had seen in the videos, in my reflection. It stood in the closet, motionless, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were studying the camera. Its body was just a black silhouette, too tall and too thin to be human, and its eyes, or where the eyes should have been, were hollow, like dark, empty voids. The camera stayed on the figure for a few seconds longer before the static cut in again, and the video ended abruptly. I sat there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. My room was dead silent, but my mind was racing with questions. How did this video get uploaded? Who filmed it? Was it some kind of prank? I texted Mark and Jess, asking if either of them knew anything about it. Jess didn't respond right away, but Mark called me almost immediately. "Ryan, I swear I didn't upload that video," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't even have the file. I haven't touched my camera in days." I believed him. Mark liked to mess around, sure, but he wouldn't take it this far. And the way his voice sounded on the phone. It was clear he was just as freaked out as I was. Jess finally texted back. All she said was, "We need to talk. Come over tonight." I grabbed my stuff and headed over to Jess's place. Mark was already there when I arrived, pacing around her living room like a caged animal. Jess looked pale, like she hadn't slept in days. Without saying a word, she motioned for us to sit down. When we did, she pulled out her phone and showed us something that made my blood run cold. It was a video file, a private one, not uploaded anywhere. She had recorded it the night after we used the Ouija board, but she hadn't shared it with us. It showed her sitting on her bed, talking to the camera about how freaked out she'd been since that night. She was trying to play it off like she didn't believe in the whole Ouija board thing, but you could tell she wasn't sleeping well. Then, about halfway through her video, the screen glitched, just like in my footage. The crackling static, the flicker of darkness, and then, out of nowhere, the shadow appeared behind her, in the corner of her room, right by her closet door, just like in mine. Jess hadn't noticed it at the time, but the figure was there, standing still, watching her. She had only noticed it when she went back to review the footage later, after we started seeing the same thing in our other videos. She paused the video on the figure, and we all stared at it in silence. It was the same thing, the same shadow, the same empty eyes. "I think it's following us," Jess whispered, her voice shaking. Mark sat down, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. It's just a stupid board game. It can't be real." But the evidence was there, staring us in the face. And as much as I wanted to agree with him, I knew something was wrong. We weren't just imagining things. This was real. And whatever it was, it had found us. I suggested we delete the videos, wipe everything clean. Maybe that would stop it, right? If we weren't putting it out there for people to see, maybe it would go away. Mark agreed, but Jess hesitated. "I don't think it's that simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's not about the videos? What if it's about us?" That thought hit me like a punch in the gut. What if this thing wasn't attached to the footage, but to us? To the three of us who had sat around that Ouija board and invited it in? Before we could come up with a plan, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out of my pocket and saw a notification that made my blood freeze. Another video had just been uploaded to our channel. This one was titled, "You Can't Hide." None of us had uploaded it. I stared at my phone, heart pounding in my chest, that notification glaring back at me. "You can't hide." I looked at Jess and Mark, my mouth dry. "Did either of you?" "No," Jess interrupted, shaking her head violently. "I didn't upload anything, I swear." Mark grabbed his phone, and I could see the same notification pop up on his screen. His face went pale, and for the first time, I could tell he was genuinely scared. He wasn't trying to crack a joke or brush it off this time. Without a word, I pulled out my laptop and opened our YouTube page. Sure enough, the new video was there, staring us down like a threat. We didn't want to click it, but we knew we had to. My fingers trembled as I hovered over the play button, and Mark leaned in closer, his voice tense. "Do it. Just play it. We need to know what's in there." I hit play, and the video started just like the last one. Black screen, static crackling in the background, louder than before. This time it wasn't just a low hum of noise. It was sharp, aggressive, like nails scraping against glass. The black screen lasted longer this time, dragging out the tension until I could feel my skin crawling. And then, just when I thought the video might be broken, the screen flickered to life. It was a shot of Mark's living room. I glanced over at Mark, who was staring at the screen in disbelief. That's my place," he whispered. The camera wasn't being held by anyone. It was stationary, as if it had been set up on a tripod or something, perfectly framing the room. Everything looked normal at first, just a quiet shot of Mark's couch and coffee table. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, out of the corner of the frame, we saw movement. Someone, stepped into view. It was the shadow again. That same tall, dark figure, standing completely still in the middle of the room. Its head was tilted, like it was listening for something. Then, as if it heard us watching, its head turned toward the camera. It didn't have a face, but somehow you could feel it looking at you. And then it started walking. Slow, deliberate steps toward the camera, getting closer and closer. With each step, the static got louder, like it was building to something, drowning out everything else. My heart was in my throat, my pulse racing as the figure reached the camera. It was so close now, I could almost make out details. Jagged edges where its face should have been, fingers too long to be human. Then the screen cut to black. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding, but before I could even process what we'd just seen, the video started again. This time, it was a shot of Jess's room. She gasped and covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. The camera was positioned in the same way, like someone had set it up without her knowing. Her bed was neatly made, her books stacked on the nightstand, the lamp casting a soft glow in the corner. But then, just like before, the figure appeared. It was standing by her bed now, still as death. The room was completely silent, but I could feel the tension radiating from Jess as she watched the screen, her face pale. The figure didn't move this time. It just stood there, like it was waiting for something. Then, without warning, the video glitched again, the static coming back in full force, louder than ever. When the screen flickered back on, we saw my room. My stomach dropped. The camera was angled right at my desk, at the same spot where I'd seen that thing in the reflection a few nights ago. This time, though, the figure wasn't standing still. It was pacing back and forth in front of my closet, its movement slow and deliberate, like it was waiting for me to walk through the door. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to turn the video off, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then, just as it reached the closet door, the figure stopped. It turned toward the camera, as if it knew we were watching. Slowly, it raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed directly at the screen, directly at us. The static cut out, and a voice, low, guttural and distorted, crackled through the speakers. "You can't hide." The video ended. The room was dead silent. Jess was shaking, her hands balled into fists on her lap. Mark stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice tight with panic. How the hell is this happening? That's my apartment. That's my apartment, and I was there all day. No one filmed that. No one's been in my place but me. I don't know, Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. But it's following us. Wherever we go, it's there. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. This thing, whatever it was, had wormed its way into our lives, and now it was getting bolder. It wasn't just messing with our videos anymore. It was inside our homes, our personal spaces, and it knew we were watching. "Okay," I said, standing up and trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to do something. We can't just sit here and wait for it to, whatever it's trying to do." "What do you suggest?" Mark snapped, the fear in his voice barely masked by frustration. "Burn the Ouija board. Call a priest. This isn't some movie, Ryan. We don't even know what this thing is." "I don't know," I admitted, my mind racing. "But we need to start by getting rid of that board. We can't just ignore it anymore." Jess nodded. "I'll bring it over. We'll get rid of it tonight." Mark seemed skeptical, but he didn't argue. He knew as well as I did that we had to try something, anything, to break whatever curse we'd brought down on ourselves. That night, we met up at Jess's place. She pulled the Ouija board out of her closet, and I swear, the moment she set it down in front of us, the temperature in the room dropped. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was just nerves, but none of us were in the mood for jokes anymore. We didn't know how to properly dispose of a Ouija board, so we decided to just burn it. Mark grabbed a lighter from his bag, and we all went out to Jess's backyard, the board in tow. The plan was simple: burn it and hope for the best. As the flames started to lick at the edges of the board, I felt this weight lift off my chest, like we were finally doing something to fight back. But just as the board began to crackle and burn, that same familiar sound echoed through the backyard. The static. It wasn't coming from a speaker or a phone this time. It was just there, surrounding us, growing louder and louder. We looked around, panic setting in. And then, from the shadows at the edge of Jess's yard, we saw it. The figure. It was standing there, watching us. The figure stood at the edge of the yard, shrouded in darkness. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The very sight of it sent a jolt of cold fear through my entire body, rooting me to the spot. Mark and Jess were frozen too, eyes wide, barely breathing. The flames from the Ouija board crackled louder behind us, casting flickering shadows across the yard. But none of us were focused on the fire anymore. We were focused on it. It was taller now. Or maybe it had always been that tall, and we just hadn't fully seen it before. Its form was still shadowy, shifting slightly as if it weren't fully solid. The eyes, or the spaces where eyes should have been, were nothing but dark, hollow voids, locked onto us. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The static buzzed around us like an angry swarm of insects. It wasn't just in my ears. It was in my head, growing louder with each second. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The noise was inside me now, and with it came something else. A pressure, like the air itself was turning against us. Mark was the first to snap out of it. We gotta go," he whispered, his voice trembling. He grabbed Jess's arm, pulling her toward the back door, but she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the figure, her whole body shaking. "Jess, come on!" Mark shouted, tugging harder, but Jess didn't budge. She just stood there, staring at the figure like she was in some kind of trance. Her lips moved, but the words were too faint for me to hear. I stepped closer, trying to pull her away, but as I reached for her, she finally spoke loud enough for us to hear. "It's saying something." Mark and I exchanged a terrified glance. "What do you mean it's saying something?" "Jess, we have to go," I pleaded, but she kept whispering, her eyes still glued to the figure. "It's in my head," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's telling me we shouldn't have burned it." Before we could react, the static cut through the air like a knife, sharp and deafening. Jess cried out, clutching her head, and fell to her knees. I tried to help her up, but the noise was so overwhelming I could barely think straight. It was like the world was vibrating around us, distorting reality. The figure began to move. Slowly, it took a step forward, the darkness around it seeming to ripple and bend. The closer it got, the more distorted everything became. The yard, the house, the fire, all of it started to blur, like we were trapped in some twisted, broken version of reality. I could barely make out Mark's voice over the static, but I saw him grab Jess, trying to pull her toward the door. "We have to get inside," he yelled, his voice muffled and distant. I didn't need convincing. I grabbed Jess's other arm, and together we dragged her back toward the house. The static grew louder, and with it, a deep, guttural growl, as if the figure was getting closer with every second. Just as we reached the back door, I turned around for one last look, and my blood turned to ice. The figure wasn't at the edge of the yard anymore. It was right behind us, its long, shadowy arm stretched out, reaching for Jess, its fingers just inches away from her shoulder. I screamed her name, and in one final burst of adrenaline, we yanked her inside and slammed the door shut. For a moment, everything went silent. The static cut off abruptly, leaving us in eerie, suffocating stillness. We stood there in the kitchen, gasping for breath, the three of us barely able to process what had just happened. Jess was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide with terror. Mark kept glancing at the windows, as if expecting the figure to burst through at any second. We need to leave," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here." I nodded, my heart still pounding. Jess was in no condition to argue. She just sat on the floor, staring at the back door like she was waiting for it to fly open. But something felt wrong. Even though we were inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe, that no matter where we went, it would follow us. Jess finally spoke, her voice trembling. "It's not going to stop, is it?" None of us answered. We didn't have to. We knew the truth. Whatever we had let in, whatever we had contacted that night with the Ouija board, it wasn't something we could run from. It wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was attached to us now, and it was only getting stronger. Mark paced around the room, his hands shaking. "We need help. Someone who knows what the hell this thing is. A priest, a psychic. I don't care. We can't handle this on our own." I pulled out my phone, desperate to find answers, but as I scrolled through, the screen began to glitch. First it was just a flicker, then the static returned. My stomach twisted as the screen distorted and warped, the same way it had in the videos. Before I could turn it off, a new notification appeared. Live. You can't hide. The title of the new video we hadn't uploaded. The channel was live streaming. From my phone. I stared at it, my hand trembling as I clicked on the notification. The live stream opened, and the screen showed a black, empty void, nothing but darkness and the faint sound of that ever-present static. But then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same figure, the one that had been haunting us. But this time, it was clearer, more defined. It was closer than it had ever been before, and as it stepped into view, I realized with a sickening jolt that the background behind it wasn't just some random darkness. It was Jess's living room. Guys, I whispered, my voice shaking. Look. They leaned in, their faces pale, as we watched the live stream in horror. The figure stood in the exact spot we were sitting. It was in the room with us, watching us through the screen. And then, as if it knew we were looking, it turned toward the camera. The static grew louder, the screen flickered, and just before the stream cut out, the figure raised its hand and pointed directly at the camera, directly at us, once more. A voice, low and guttural, crackled through the speaker, the same voice from the last video. You can't hide. The stream ended. We sat in silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. This thing wasn't just haunting our videos or our homes anymore. It was inside everything now. Our technology, our minds, our lives. There was no running from it, no escaping it. And as I stared at the phone, my hands shaking, I realized with a sickening certainty that the worst was yet to come. The Ouija board told us not to look outside. Now something is staring through the window. All right, I know how this is going to sound. A Ouija board? Seriously? But before you roll your eyes and click away, just hear me out. What happened to me and my friends was so bizarre. I still don't fully understand it. I've never really been one for ghost stories or paranormal stuff. My friends, same deal. We were just a group of bored 20-somethings, killing time on a Saturday night in my buddy Ryan's basement. He has one of those basements that feels almost too cozy. Soft lighting, comfy couches, a fridge stocked with beer. A perfect place to just hang out and forget about the world for a few hours. The Ouija board wasn't even our idea at first. It was Ryan's girlfriend, Abby. She showed up halfway through the night with this old, wooden board under her arm, looking all smug like she was about to drop some groundbreaking party game. "Found it in the attic," she said. "You guys ever try one of these?" Now, we all laughed at her. Ryan groaned, rolled his eyes, the whole thing. I mean, who brings a Ouija board to a chill hangout? But Abby was persistent. "Come on, don't be scared. It's just for fun. Besides, what else are we doing?" And, yeah, she had a point. We were just sitting there, working on a third round of beers and trying to decide whether to watch a movie or keep playing some stupid card game. Eventually, we gave in. Why not? Worst case, it'd be a funny story about how we played with a Ouija board and nothing happened. The thing about Ouija boards is that they look so harmless. It's just a flat piece of wood with letters and numbers carved into it, right? But the minute you touch the planchette, there's this weird energy, like you've opened a door, even if it's just in your own head. We set it up on the coffee table in front of us. Abby sat across from Ryan, her dark hair hanging over her face like some cliché horror movie chick, and I was sitting next to her. Our friend Matt sat across from me, clearly just as skeptical as the rest of us. We all placed our fingers on the planchette, snickering a bit, not taking it seriously at all. "What do we even ask?" Matt said, clearly trying not to laugh. Abby shrugged. "The usual stuff, I guess. Is anyone here? Are there any spirits who want to talk to us?" We waited. Nothing. The planchette just sat there, motionless, and we exchanged looks, trying to keep straight faces. Then, it moved. I know what you're thinking. Someone was messing with us, right? One of us had to be pushing it. And that's what I thought too, at first. But when I looked around the table, everyone had the same confused look. Even Abby, who was the most into this stuff, seemed genuinely surprised. The planchette slid slowly, almost lazily, toward the word yes. "Okay, who's screwing around?" Ryan asked, his voice a little shaky. But no one answered. In fact, no one even moved. We all exchanged nervous glances, but we kept going. I mean, we were in it now, right? "Who are we talking to?" Abby asked, leaning in a little too eagerly. For a few seconds, the planchette didn't move. Then, slowly, it began sliding again. This time, it spelled out NOTIMPORTANT. Not important? That's kind of creepy, Matt muttered under his breath, but none of us laughed. Weird, yeah, but still not enough to freak us out. Not yet. Abby, always the curious one, pushed it further. Okay, what do you want? This time the planchette moved faster, as if it was gaining momentum. It spelled out one word, LOOK. Look where? Ryan asked, his voice edged with impatience. And then, as if the board had been waiting for that question, the planchette darted to the corner where the word goodbye was etched. It stopped there, as if to say, that's it, we're done. That's it? I asked, leaning back. Look where? That doesn't even make sense. Abby shrugged and pulled her hands away from the board. I don't know. It's probably just a bunch of nonsense. These things never work anyway. But then it happened. We heard a soft thump, like something hit the window. It was subtle at first, just enough to make us all glance toward the far side of the basement, where a narrow rectangular window was set into the wall, half covered by curtains. Ryan frowned and stood up. Probably a bird or something, he muttered, walking over to check it out. I watched him, expecting him to pull back the curtain, say there was nothing there, and we'd laugh about it, right? Only, he didn't move the curtain. He just stood there, frozen, staring at the window, like he'd seen something that didn't quite make sense. What's wrong? I asked, half joking, half nervous now. Ryan didn't answer. Dude? Matt called out, standing up and walking over to him. He reached out to touch Ryan's shoulder, and that's when Ryan finally spoke. His voice was low and shaky. Don't look. We all stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. What do you mean, don't look? Abby asked, her voice sounding smaller than usual. Ryan slowly turned around, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. The Ouija board, he whispered. It told us not to look outside. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure we were just playing anymore. None of us moved for what felt like forever. Ryan's words just hung there, suspended in the air like they didn't belong, like they didn't make any sense at all. What do you mean, don't look? Matt asked again, his voice wavering a little. He wasn't trying to sound brave anymore. There was no way to joke about this. The room felt colder, like the basement had shifted in some weird way, even though everything still looked exactly the same. Same low lighting, same soft hum of the mini-fridge in the corner, but something was off. Ryan just shook his head, still staring at the window. I don't know, man. I feel like something's out there, and we shouldn't look at it. He sounded almost embarrassed, like he knew how crazy it sounded but couldn't help himself. Abby was the first to snap out of it. All right, come on, guys. This is stupid. It's just a Ouija board. There's no don't look outside rule. It probably just, I don't know, it messed with us. Or one of us was moving the thing without realizing it. There's nothing out there. I wanted to believe her. We all did, but no one was laughing anymore. Seriously, Ryan, just pull back the curtain, she continued, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the edge in her voice. Let's get this over with. Ryan swallowed hard and shook his head again. No way. This was getting ridiculous. Matt, always the bold one, shrugged and walked over to the window himself. Fine, I'll look. It's probably a squirrel or something. Or maybe the wind knocked something over outside. He reached for the curtain. Don't! Ryan snapped, more forcefully this time. He grabbed Matt's wrist before he could pull the curtain back. His face was dead serious, like he was genuinely scared. Now, Matt wasn't easily spooked, but something about the way Ryan was acting made him hesitate. His hand hovered just inches from the curtain, fingers twitching. What the hell, man? It's just a window. Ryan let go of his wrist, taking a shaky step back. I don't know, dude. I have this feeling. Whatever's out there, it doesn't want us to see it. That's when I started to get that sinking feeling in my gut. You know the one. where your body just knows something's wrong before your brain catches up. I hadn't looked at the window. None of us had, except Ryan. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized he hadn't even touched the curtain. He hadn't actually seen anything. But whatever he felt, it was strong enough to freak him out. Abby sighed, clearly frustrated. She stood up and walked over to where Matt was standing, her arms crossed over her chest. Fine. If none of you are going to man up, I will. We're not going to sit here all night freaking out over nothing. But right as she was about to pull the curtain back, we all heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the window, as if something, or someone, was gently knocking on the glass. Just enough to get our attention, but not enough to break it. The sound was so faint, it almost blended with the hum of the mini-fridge. But once you noticed it, you couldn't unhear it. Abby froze, her hand inches from the curtain. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. She glanced back at us, her expression shifting from annoyed to, I don't know, fear? Unease? Her face was pale now, her eyes wide. That wasn't a bird, right? None of us answered. We just stood there, listening to the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even think straight. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to bolt up the stairs, run out of that basement, and never come back. Maybe it's just the wind, I offered, though I didn't believe it for a second. The taps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. Yeah, right, Matt muttered, stepping away from the window. Wind doesn't tap like that. Abby finally backed away from the curtain, her hand trembling slightly. Okay, this is officially freaking me out. The tapping stopped. Just like that, the noise cut off as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind an eerie, oppressive silence. We all stood there, frozen, not daring to move, as if whatever was outside could hear us. And then, for the first time since we started this stupid game, I heard a sound that sent chills straight down my spine. It was a voice. A low, whispery voice, barely audible but distinct. It was coming from right outside the window. Let me in. The words were faint, almost like a breath, but I swear I heard them. And by the looks on everyone else's faces, they heard it too. Ryan took a step back, his eyes wide with terror. I told you not to look. Who the hell is that? Matt whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us answered. We didn't need to. There was no way any of us were going to check. Abby's face had gone completely white. I don't like this, she whispered. We should leave. We need to leave now. For once, we all agreed. Without another word, we all bolted for the stairs, scrambling over each other to get away from that window. My heart was in my throat as I ran, my legs shaky and weak, like I'd just woken up from a nightmare. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I made the mistake of looking back. Just for a second. I don't know why I did it, but I turned around and glanced at the window. The curtain was still closed, but there was something on the other side of it. A shadow, tall and thin, like a figure pressed up against the glass, watching us. I didn't stop to get a better look. I didn't want to. I just ran. We all piled out of the basement and into the living room, gasping for breath like we'd just escaped something unspeakable. Abby was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling the cops, she said, her voice trembling. Ryan shook his head. Number don't. What do you mean, don't? She snapped. Someone's outside. They were tapping on the window. Ryan swallowed hard, his face pale and sweaty. It's not a person. And that's when I realized something. The Ouija board hadn't said not to look outside. It had said look, and maybe, just maybe, that's what it wanted us to do all along. We stood there in Ryan's living room, all of us out of breath and completely on edge. Abby had her phone in hand, her fingers trembling like she was ready to dial 911 any second, but none of us were talking. There was this awful silence hanging in the room, like we were all waiting for something to happen. You know when the air feels too thick, like it's pressing down on you? That's exactly what it felt like. I was sweating, but I felt cold at the same time. No one said a word about what we'd just seen, what I had seen, a shadow at the window. I wanted to bring it up, but I didn't. Not yet, because if I said it out loud, it would make everything worse, more real. Ryan was pacing back and forth in front of the couch, his hands gripping the back of his neck. I could tell he was trying to hold it together, but the guy was shaking. And honestly, I didn't blame him. He kept muttering, "This isn't right, this isn't right." Abby finally broke the silence. "We should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here now." Ryan stopped pacing and turned to look at her, his face pale. "And go where? You think leaving's gonna fix this?" "What do you mean?" Abby shot back, frustrated. "You seriously want to stay here? After everything that just happened? After what you heard?" Ryan didn't answer. He just looked at her, like he didn't know what to say, like he was trying to figure out if any of this was real. I don't think any of us really knew what to do next. It was like we were stuck between wanting to run and not knowing where the hell we'd even go if we did. And then the lights went out. I don't mean they flickered or dimmed. They cut out. Everything in the house went pitch black in an instant, like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second we were standing in the living room, trying to figure out what the hell to do, and the next we were plunged into total darkness. Abby screamed. I don't blame her. I probably would have too, if my throat hadn't clenched up the second the lights went off. I felt this wave of cold rush through me, like all the warmth had been sucked out of the room in an instant. "What the hell?" Matt shouted, fumbling around in the dark. "Is this some kind of sick joke? Did you forget to pay your electric bill, Ryan?" But Ryan wasn't answering. No one was. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to break through my chest. The only sound in the room was the heavy breathing of all four of us, and it felt like we were being watched, like something was in the room with us. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, we heard the door. The back door. It creaked open, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was pushing it. I whipped around, trying to see through the darkness, but it was impossible. It was like the night outside had poured in through the door, and now it was everywhere. There was no moonlight, no street lights seeping in through the windows, just darkness swallowing everything whole. My eyes couldn't adjust to it. They couldn't find anything to focus on, no shapes, no outlines. What was that? Abby's voice was shaking. I was about to answer her when I saw it. A faint glow. It wasn't coming from the windows. It wasn't coming from the street outside. It was coming from the Ouija board, still lying on the coffee table in the basement, just below the stairs. That damn thing was glowing, a soft, pulsing light, as if it had been switched on. Only, Ouija boards don't have batteries. None of us said a word. We were all staring at the same thing. The planchette was sitting there, dead center on the board, and it was moving. Slow, but steady. None of us were touching it. None of us were even near it, but it was sliding across the board on its own, gliding over the letters like it had a mind of its own. "What the hell?" Matt whispered, trailing off. We watched as it spelled out 2 words, clear as day. LOOKOUTSIDE. Abby backed away from the table like it had just bitten her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No way. I'm not doing that. We're not doing that." Ryan, still staring at the board, was trembling. "I told you," he muttered. "I told you not to look outside." "Then why is it telling us to?" Matt snapped, his voice tight with fear. "What does it want? What's outside?" None of us wanted to answer that. None of us wanted to know. But we were in too deep now. Suddenly, there was another noise. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the back door, the one that had just opened on its own. Something was moving just beyond the threshold, something we couldn't see but could definitely hear. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone out of my pocket and switched on the flashlight, aiming it toward the back of the house. The beam of light cut through the darkness like a knife, but what it revealed made my blood run cold. There were handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the inside of the back door like someone, or multiple people, had been pressing their palms against the wood, trying to push their way in. But the prints weren't fresh. They looked old, decayed, like they'd been there for years, only no one had ever noticed them before. "Oh my God," Abby whispered, backing away, her hands covering her mouth. "What is this? What the hell is this?" The scraping noise continued, growing louder, more frantic, like whatever was outside was trying harder and harder to get in. The handprints seemed to pulse in the flashlight's glow, like they were alive, like they were moving. I don't know how else to describe it, but they almost seemed to stretch and shift, like the door was breathing. That's when Matt did something I'll never forget. He walked to the window. "Matt, don't!" I shouted, but it was too late. He was already there, standing right in front of the narrow basement window, his hand reaching for the curtain. "I want to see," he said, his voice hollow, like he was in a trance. "I need to see." "No, you don't!" Ryan screamed, grabbing him by the arm, trying to pull him back. But Matt yanked free, and in one quick motion, he ripped the curtain aside. I didn't want to look. I told myself not to, but something deep inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, forced me to glance. And that's when I saw it. Standing outside the window, just inches from the glass, was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its skin pale and almost translucent, like it had never seen sunlight. It had no eyes, just empty black pits where they should have been. Its mouth was wide open, far wider than any human's should be, and its lips were pulled back in a twisted, unnatural grin. But it wasn't the face that terrified me the most. It was the way it was staring, not at Matt, but straight at me. I froze. That thing outside the window, it wasn't just looking at me. It knew me. It was like it had been waiting for me this entire time, like I was the one it had wanted all along. Its mouth stayed twisted in that horrific grin, teeth too sharp, too many, and those black, empty eye sockets seemed to be drinking me in, like they could see right through me. My blood went cold, and I felt rooted to the spot, like I couldn't move, even if I tried. "Shut the curtain!" Ryan yelled, snapping me out of whatever trance I'd fallen into. I jerked back, instinctively grabbing for Matt, pulling him away from the window. He didn't fight me this time. He was just standing there, staring blankly at that thing. He looked dazed, almost like he hadn't fully processed what he'd just seen. "What the hell is that?" Abby's voice was barely above a whisper. She was backing away from the window, her eyes wide with terror. Ryan was already moving, yanking the curtain closed as fast as he could, his hands trembling. The scraping sound on the back door grew louder, more urgent, like whatever was outside could feel that we'd seen it, like it was trying harder to get in now. "Don't let it in," Ryan muttered, more to himself than to any of us. "We can't let it in." Abby was pacing now, her hands in her hair, her breath coming in short gasps. "We have to leave. We have to get out of here." "We can't," Ryan said, shaking his head. "If we leave, it'll follow us. It's here because of the board. Because we asked it to come." "What are you talking about?" Matt said, his voice shaky. He was still in shock, his face pale, his eyes darting back to the window every few seconds. "We didn't ask for anything like this." Ryan looked at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "We asked it to look, and now it's here." I didn't want to believe him. None of this made sense. A stupid game couldn't summon something like that, right? This wasn't supposed to be real. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life. But the handprints on the door, the figure outside the window, the way that thing had stared at me, none of it felt fake. It was too real, too wrong. Abby was losing it. So, what? We just sit here and wait for it to come in and kill us? We have to do something. I didn't have any better ideas, but staying inside, trapped with that thing just outside, felt like a death sentence. I pulled out my phone, trying to call 911. But the screen stayed black. No signal, no bars, nothing. "My phone's not working," I muttered, panic starting to creep into my voice. Matt checked his own phone, shaking it in frustration. "Same, no service. It's like we're cut off." Ryan paced the living room, his hands running through his hair, trying to think. Okay. We just need to keep the doors locked. Don't look outside. Whatever that thing is, it wants us to see it. That's how it gets in." "How do you know that?" Abby asked, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know," Ryan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can feel it. It's like the more you look at it, the closer it gets." "What if it's already inside?" I asked, the thought hitting me like a punch to the gut. "What if it doesn't need to get in through the door? What if it's already here?" Silence. That possibility hung in the air, heavier than anything we'd felt all night. We all looked at each other, then around the room, like we were suddenly aware of every shadow, every corner. What if it was watching us from the darkness, waiting for the right moment? Then, from the window, we heard it again. That voice, whispering. But this time, it was different. It wasn't asking to be let in. It wasn't calling out. It was laughing. A low, breathy chuckle that made my skin crawl. It was like it knew something we didn't, like it had already won. "I can't do this," Abby cried, backing up until her back hit the wall. "I can't stay here. We need to go. Now." Ryan grabbed her arm, his voice urgent. "No! If we leave, we're giving it what it wants. We have to stay together, stay inside. As long as we don't let it in, we'll be okay." But I didn't believe him. None of us did. I could see it in their faces, the way their eyes darted toward the door, toward the windows, like we were all weighing our chances of making a break for it. Could we run fast enough? Could we get away? And that's when the lights flickered back on. For a moment, the room was bathed in soft, golden light again, and it almost felt normal. Almost. But then we heard it, the soft creak of a floorboard. From the basement. It was subtle, barely there, but unmistakable. Something was moving down there. We all froze. No one dared to breathe. "What the hell?" Matt whispered, his voice tight with fear. "How did it get in?" Ryan's face went pale. "The board," he said, his voice shaking. "It's still down there." "Are you saying it's coming from the board?" Abby asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Ryan snapped, pacing in circles. "But I think it opened a door. We need to close it." "You're not suggesting we go down there," I said, my voice sounding as terrified as I felt. The idea of going back into that basement made my stomach churn. That's where this all started. It felt like the epicenter of everything wrong. But Ryan was already moving toward the stairs, his jaw clenched. "We don't have a choice. It's either we go down there and close whatever door we opened, or it comes up here." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him we were safer up here, that we should just barricade the door and wait it out. But deep down, I knew he was right. If we didn't do something, that thing wasn't going to stay outside. It wasn't going to wait forever. Reluctantly, we followed him down the stairs, one by one, each step creaking under our weight. The basement felt different now. The air was thicker, heavier, and the Ouija board, God, the Ouija board was glowing brighter than ever, that same soft, pulsing light. The planchette was moving again, but this time we weren't asking it anything. It was moving on its own, faster now, sliding across the board with purpose, like it was trying to tell us something. Ryan stepped toward it cautiously. "We need to say goodbye," he whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for the planchette. But before he could touch it, the laughter stopped. And then, from the darkest corner of the basement, we saw it. The figure. Standing there, impossibly tall, its head bent to fit in the low-ceilinged room. Its skin was still that same sickly pale grey, stretched too thin over its long, bony limbs. But its eyes, this time, they weren't empty. They were black, glistening with some kind of malevolent intelligence. It grinned at us, and then, slowly, it took a step forward. None of us moved. We just stood there, paralyzed, staring at that thing in the corner of the basement. It was towering over us, its bony limbs too long, too wrong, and those black, soulless eyes were locked onto us like we were prey. That twisted grin hadn't left its face. It was like it knew we couldn't escape, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. Ryan, his voice barely a whisper, spoke first. We have to say goodbye. His eyes darted to the Ouija board, glowing brighter and more frantically than before. The planchette was still moving, but now it seemed to be circling the board, not spelling anything out, just spinning faster and faster. Whatever door we had opened, it was wide open now. But none of us were looking at the board anymore. Our eyes were locked on the thing in the corner. It took another step toward us. Its foot landed with a soft, deliberate thud on the cold concrete floor. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Its shadow. It wasn't right. It didn't match the figure in front of us. The shadow was distorted, growing longer, stretching out in every direction like it was trying to consume the entire room. Matt was shaking uncontrollably, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Ryan, man," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "We need to do something. Now." Ryan nodded, but his eyes never left the figure. "Just keep your eyes on it. Don't let it get closer." "How?" Abby's voice cracked, panic finally bubbling over. She was standing as far back as she could, pressed against the stairs like she was ready to bolt any second. "How do we stop it?" The thing grinned wider, its mouth opening far too much, revealing jagged, sharp teeth. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The longer we stood there, the more we understood. It was already inside, and we had brought it here. I don't know what came over me, but suddenly I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear was suffocating, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I lunged toward the Ouija board, desperate to end this. My hands grabbed the planchette, and I shoved it toward goodbye, my fingers trembling as I forced it across the wood. As soon as I touched the board, the thing let out a low, guttural growl. The air in the basement turned freezing cold, and for a second, I thought I felt something brush against the back of my neck, something cold and bony, like fingers. Ryan rushed forward, grabbing the planchette with me, and together we pushed it, dragging it inch by inch across the board until it landed on goodbye. We waited. For a second, nothing happened. The glow from the board flickered and then faded, and the basement was plunged into darkness again. The only sound was our own ragged breathing. "Did it work?" Abby whispered, her voice barely audible. She hadn't moved from the stairs. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that pushing the planchette to goodbye had somehow closed the door, that whatever nightmare we had unleashed was over. But then we heard it. The scraping sound again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the window or the back door. It was coming from the ceiling, from right above us. We all looked up, and there, in the dim light, we saw it. The shadow. It wasn't gone. It had moved. Now it was crawling along the ceiling, stretching its long, thin limbs across the beams, its head twisting at an impossible angle to keep its eyes on us. The grin was still there, wider now, splitting its face almost in two. "Oh my God," Matt whispered, backing away, his voice shaking. "It's still here." We had closed the board. We had done what we were supposed to do, but somehow it wasn't enough. Whatever we had brought into the house, it wasn't going to leave. It had found a way in, and now it wasn't just in the basement. It was everywhere. "We need to get out," I said, grabbing Ryan's arm. "We need to get out now." Ryan didn't argue. None of us did. We scrambled up the stairs, practically tripping over each other in our panic. As we reached the living room, I glanced back for just a second. That thing. It was following us, its limbs unfolding, reaching for us, its shadow stretching across the floor. We didn't stop running. We didn't even grab our stuff. We just burst out of the front door into the cold night air and kept going, sprinting down the street like our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. It wasn't until we reached the end of the block, gasping for air, that we stopped to look back at Ryan's house. From the outside, it looked completely normal. Quiet, dark, like nothing had ever happened. But we all knew the truth. Something was inside. Something we had let in. Abby was crying, her hands shaking as she tried to pull herself together. What do we do now? I don't know, Ryan whispered, his face pale and haunted. But we can't go back. We stood there, huddled together on the sidewalk, watching Ryan's house from a distance. And then, from one of the upstairs windows, I saw it. A shadow, watching us. It was smiling. I haven't been back to Ryan's house since that night. None of us have. We don't talk about it either. Not really. Every once in a while we'll get a text from one another, just checking in, making sure everything's still normal. But we don't talk about what happened in the basement. We don't talk about the Ouija board. And we definitely don't talk about that thing in the window. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is we played a game we shouldn't have, and something came through. But here's the worst part. Every night when I try to sleep, I get this feeling, like something's watching me. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear it. That soft, familiar sound. Tap, tap, tap. The Ouija board gave us a name. Every time we say it, something moves in the room. Okay, so I don't even know how to begin this, but I guess the best place to start is by saying that I've never really been into spooky stuff. Like, you know those people who want to be scared, watch horror movies at night with all the lights off and get a kick out of creeping themselves out? Yeah, not me. I've always been more of the, I'd rather watch a comedy and sleep easy type. But, as it turns out, even the most skeptical person can get pulled into some seriously weird stuff if you're hanging out with the wrong, or maybe the right crowd. It all started about a month ago. I had just moved into this old house with two of my friends, Matt and Jake. It was your typical, we just graduated and need cheap rent kind of deal. The house wasn't anything special, but it had character, creaky floors, weird drafts that came from nowhere, and a basement none of us were excited to explore. You know, the kind of place you joke about being haunted, but never really think is haunted. Yeah, famous last words. So, we were settling in, and one night, Matt suggested we have a housewarming night, just the three of us. We ordered some pizza, cracked open a few beers, and were generally having a chill time. That's when Jake pulled out this old, dusty box from his backpack. Now, before I go any further, let me explain something about Jake. He's that guy who's always trying to freak people out for fun. Like he'll send you creepy texts in the middle of the night just to mess with you, or tell you ghost stories when you're half asleep on a camping trip. So, when he pulled out that box, I already knew something was up. Found this at a garage sale, Jake said, all casual, but with that stupid grin on his face. It was a Ouija board. You know, one of those old school wooden ones, with the letters and numbers, and that little heart-shaped thing you move around. I rolled my eyes immediately. I mean, really, a Ouija board? I'd seen enough bad horror movies to know that nothing good ever came from playing around with those things. But Matt, he was all in. He's one of those people who's just skeptical enough to not believe in ghosts, but curious enough to want to see if something weird will happen. After some back and forth, they managed to convince me to sit down with them and just try it. And I was like, fine, whatever. But when nothing happens, you both owe me $5. So, we set the board on the coffee table, dimmed the lights for atmosphere, Jake's idea, obviously, and got ready to laugh at how stupid the whole thing was. But it didn't quite go like that. At first, nothing happened. We asked the typical dumb questions like, is there anyone here? And give us a sign. The planchette didn't move an inch. I felt myself relax, like, okay, this is exactly what I thought. Just a stupid game. But then Matt asked, "What's your name?" And the thing moved. Now, before you roll your eyes and say, okay, someone was clearly pushing it, trust me, I thought the same thing. But I had my hands on that thing too. And I swear on my life, I wasn't moving it. Jake looked genuinely surprised. And even Matt, who was usually pretty cool about everything, started getting that nervous laugh, like maybe we were all in over our heads. The planchette slid across the board, slow at first, then faster, spelling out letters. And this is the part that stuck with me. It spelled out a name, clear as day. Jeremiah. Jeremiah. We just kind of sat there staring at the board. I mean, none of us knew a Jeremiah. It wasn't like some inside joke or anything. It was just a name. A name none of us had ever mentioned before. The room felt different after that, like the air was heavier, almost electric. Jake, being Jake, shrugged it off and was like, "Cool, we got a name. Who wants another beer?" But Matt and I? We were freaked out, though neither of us wanted to admit it. We ended up packing the board away after that, shoving it back into its box like nothing happened. But the weird thing is, it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like we'd opened a door, or started something we couldn't just stop. The night went on like normal, but there was this tension, like none of us wanted to be the one to bring it up, but we all knew something wasn't right. I went to bed later, trying to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was overreacting. It was just a dumb game, right? Except that's when the noises started. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak outside my door. Now, I live in an old house, so creaky floors aren't exactly a big deal, but this was different. It was slow, like someone was walking, but hesitant. I held my breath, listening as the sound moved down the hall, right past my door, and then it stopped. Dead silence. I lay there for a few more minutes, heart racing, telling myself it was Matt or Jake heading to the bathroom or grabbing a snack. No big deal. But when I finally worked up the courage to check in the morning, both of them swore they hadn't been up. That was the first time I felt it, this cold, nagging feeling that we'd messed up. That whatever we'd done by asking for that name wasn't just a dumb prank anymore. We'd asked for a name, and something had given it to us. The next morning, things were off. And I don't just mean for me. When I walked into the kitchen, Matt and Jake were already there, looking like they hadn't slept either. We kind of sat in this weird, awkward silence at first, all of us just sipping coffee, trying to act like we weren't thinking about the same thing, but it was impossible not to. "So, anyone else hear something last night?" I finally asked, trying to sound casual, even though my voice was a little shaky. Jake raised an eyebrow, like he didn't believe me. "Dude, if you're trying to freak us out again, it's not gonna work." But Matt wasn't laughing this time. He just gave me this look, like, "Yeah, I heard it too," and nodded. "I heard someone walking around," he said, eyes flicking toward the hallway like he was expecting to see someone standing there. "But when I checked, nothing. You guys were both in your rooms." Now, Jake might be the prankster, but he's not the type to get freaked out easily. So when he got real quiet and looked down at his cup like he didn't want to say something, that's when I knew this wasn't just in my head. "I thought I saw something," Jake muttered after a long pause. "Like, in my room. Just for a second, you know. Out of the corner of my eye. I figured I was just tired." That was enough to set the tone for the day. It was like this cloud had settled over the house, and none of us wanted to admit it, but we all felt it. Something was wrong. There were these little things that started piling up. The house just felt different. The air was always cold, even though it was the middle of summer. Doors that we swore we'd closed would be wide open when we turned around. The lights flickered just a little more than normal, and sometimes the bulbs would buzz like there was something messing with the electricity. We didn't talk about the Ouija board after that first night. None of us wanted to, but the weird stuff didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. It was a couple of days later when it really escalated. I was home alone, which was rare because at least one of the guys was usually around. But that afternoon, Matt had gone to work and Jake was out running errands. I figured I'd take advantage of the peace and get some work done, clear my head. I was sitting at the kitchen table, typing away on my laptop when I heard it again. That same slow, creaking sound, like someone was walking through the hallway just outside the kitchen. My heart immediately started racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. It's an old house, I reminded myself. Houses settle. It's probably just the wind. Sure. I got up, figuring I'd check it out just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I walked into the hallway and nothing. No one. The door was closed, no windows open, no drafts, just silence. But then, as I turned to head back to the kitchen, I swear to you, I felt it. This soft, cold breeze brush against the back of my neck. It was subtle, but it was there. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, expecting to see someone standing there. But nope, still nothing. I was done at that point. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house, waiting in my car until Matt got home. I didn't care if it made me look like an idiot. I wasn't about to be the guy who stuck around when something weird was going down. I've seen enough horror movies to know how that plays out. When Matt and Jake got home later, I told them what happened, expecting them to brush it off or tell me I was imagining things. But Matt, man, he looked spooked. He didn't say anything for a minute, just kind of nodded like he understood exactly what I was talking about. Every time I say the name, Matt said quietly, I hear something in my room. It's small, like a tapping sound, but it's there. That hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just me. We were all experiencing it. Wait, Jake said, his face pale for once. Every time you say the name. Yeah, Matt confirmed. Jeremiah. As soon as the word left his mouth, there was a thud, loud, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. We all froze. At that moment, none of us moved. It wasn't like the usual creaks or groans from the house settling. It was this deep, hollow sound, like someone, or something, had slammed a door hard. We just stood there, staring at each other, waiting to see if it would happen again. When nothing followed, Jake, trying to act brave, but failing, said, "Okay, we're officially haunted." I couldn't help it. My stomach turned. "We shouldn't have used that board," I muttered. "We did something. We invited something in, and now it's here." Jake laughed, but it wasn't his usual cocky laugh. This was more nervous, shaky. "It's not like we summoned a demon or something, right? I mean, that's not how these things work." Matt didn't look so sure, and honestly, neither was I. That night, none of us slept. We tried, believe me, we tried. But every little sound, every draft of cold air felt like a warning, like something was watching us, like we weren't alone in the house anymore. The worst part, it wasn't just the noises. Something else was happening. Every time one of us said the name, Jeremiah, something in the room would move. It started small, like a chair scraping a few inches when no one was near it. Then it was the curtains shifting when the windows were closed. I even saw a picture frame tip over on its own, right in front of me, like some invisible hand had reached out and nudged it. The name had a power now, and we were stupid enough to keep saying it, like we were testing the limits, daring whatever was in the house to show itself. But the thing is, it wasn't just a game anymore. We were living with it. By the time the third night rolled around, none of us could deny it anymore. Something was in the house with us. Whatever we'd invited in by messing with that Ouija board was sticking around. And the name, Jeremiah, every time one of us said it, something moved. It had become this sick sort of experiment at first, like, oh, let's see what happens this time. But now it wasn't funny. It was real. That night, we were all sitting in the living room, none of us really talking. The atmosphere was thick, like the air had weight to it. You could feel the tension, like we were waiting for something to happen, but none of us wanted to be the one to trigger it. Every time we said the name, it felt like we were giving whatever it was more power, like we were feeding it. So we just sat there, pretending like we were watching TV, but really just listening, waiting. Then, without warning, Matt's phone rang, cutting through the silence. We all jumped, even though it was just a ringtone. But man, you could tell none of us were calm. Matt looked at the screen, furrowing his brow. "It's an unknown number," he said, showing it to us. Jake laughed, but it was that same nervous laugh from before. "Don't answer it. Last thing we need is some creepy call in the middle of this." Matt, of course, ignored him and picked up. "Hello?" At first, his face was totally neutral. He listened, said a few yeahs and uh-huhs, and then he just froze. His face went pale, like all the blood drained out of him in a second. "What is it?" I asked, leaning in, my heart already pounding because I could tell from the look on his face that something was wrong. He didn't answer me. He didn't say anything. He just hung up the phone and stared at it like it was going to explode. Jake waved a hand in front of his face, trying to snap him out of whatever weird trance he was in. "Matt, dude, what's going on?" Matt finally looked up, eyes wide, and said, They knew my name." That hit me like a ton of bricks. "What do you mean? Who was it?" "I don't know," Matt whispered, his voice shaky. "But they said my name, and then they whispered Jeremiah." None of us said anything after that for a long moment. We just sat there, the air around us suddenly feeling colder, the shadows in the corners of the room looking deeper. I felt like something was watching us, waiting for us to do or say something that would let it get closer. Then, in the quiet, there was this sound. It was faint at first, like someone dragging their fingers along the wall, just outside the room. Slow, deliberate. I swear to you, it was the most unnatural noise I've ever heard, like fingernails scraping across wood, coming from the hallway. Matt was the first one to stand up. "That's coming from upstairs," he said, voice low. None of us wanted to go, but at the same time, none of us wanted to be the coward who stayed behind either. So, together, we walked toward the staircase. The sound was louder now, closer, like it was moving along the wall just ahead of us. We got to the bottom of the stairs, and that's when we saw it. At the top of the staircase, right outside Matt's bedroom door, there was a shadow. Not like the kind you see when a light hits something, but darker, like an actual figure made of shadow standing there. It didn't move, didn't shift. It just stood still, like it was waiting. "Do you see that?" I whispered, though I didn't know why I was whispering. It's not like whatever that thing was didn't know we were there. Jake's eyes were wide, his hand gripping the railing so tight his knuckles were white. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Matt was staring at the shadow, almost like he was in a trance again. "It's Jeremiah," he said under his breath, like he couldn't help himself. The second he said the name, the shadow moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run, but it slid forward, closer to the stairs, like it was gliding across the floor. And then, this part still gives me chills to think about, the temperature in the house dropped instantly. It was like stepping into a freezer except colder, and I could feel the breath leave my lungs, like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Matt, shut up!" I hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. We stumbled down the stairs, Jake right behind us, and bolted into the living room, slamming the door behind us. Not that it would do anything, but it made me feel a little better to have something between us and whatever that was. We sat there in silence for a while, all of us breathing hard, staring at the door, waiting to see if the shadow would follow. But it didn't. The house was silent again, except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. No one said anything for a long time, until finally Jake broke the silence. "We need to stop saying the name," he said, his voice shaky. "Every time we say it, that thing gets stronger. It's like it's feeding off us." Matt didn't argue this time. He just nodded, looking pale and freaked out. We all were. And that's when we made a pact. We wouldn't say the name again. Not out loud. Not ever. But here's the thing. Even when you don't say it, you can still feel it. After that night, the house didn't go back to normal. It still felt off, like it was holding its breath, waiting for one of us to slip up. The shadows in the house felt longer, like they stretched out in places they hadn't before. The noises didn't stop either. Scraping sounds, faint whispers, sometimes a soft, almost imperceptible thud that would come from the walls or upstairs. We tried to ignore it, but it was always there, just out of sight, just out of reach, like something lurking, waiting for us to mess up again. And that's when the knocking started. It was small at first, just a faint tapping on the walls when we were trying to sleep. But then it got louder, more deliberate. One night, I woke up to what sounded like someone pounding on my bedroom door. When I opened it, of course, no one was there. The worst part, we'd all hear the knocking at different times. One night, it would be on Matt's door. The next, it would be Jake's. Always one of us. Always when we were alone. But it wasn't until the night I woke up to my bedroom door wide open, after I'd locked it, that I realized we weren't just dealing with noises and shadows anymore. It wanted in. I didn't sleep after the night I woke up to my bedroom door wide open. I couldn't. None of us could. We tried to keep to our pact, not saying the name, not talking about it, but it didn't matter. Whatever we'd let into the house didn't need us to say the name anymore. It was in now. The knocking, the shadows, the cold spots. Those were just its way of letting us know it wasn't going anywhere. After that night, I started keeping my door locked. Not that it made a difference. Every morning, I'd wake up and the door would be open again, just a crack. Like something had been standing there, watching, waiting. The other guys had the same thing happen. We stopped mentioning it to each other after a while because what was the point? We knew it was happening, and the more we acknowledged it, the worse things seemed to get. It wasn't long before the knocking turned into something else. One night, I was lying in bed, just staring at the ceiling, because sleep was impossible now. The knocking had been going on for about an hour, soft and rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingernail on the wall just outside my door. Tap, tap, tap. I was trying to tune it out when all of a sudden it stopped. That silence was somehow worse than the knocking. And then I heard breathing. It was faint, just on the other side of the door, but unmistakable. Slow, raspy breaths, like someone was standing right there, just inches away from me, separated only by a thin layer of wood. I froze, my entire body tense, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just listened. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a minute or two. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even get up to check the door. I just lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did, at least, not to me. The next morning, Jake looked rough, like more than usual. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale, and his hands were shaking as he poured himself a cup of coffee. I didn't even have to ask him what was wrong. I already knew. He sat down at the table, and for a minute, we just sat there in silence. Then he said, in a voice so low I almost didn't hear him, "I saw something last night." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it was in my room," Jake whispered, looking down at his coffee like he didn't want to make eye contact. "I woke up around 3 a.m. to the knocking. It was louder than usual, like someone was banging on the walls. And then, my closet door opened. I swallowed hard. "Jake, don't..." "No, listen," he interrupted, his voice shaking. "I thought maybe it was a draft or something, you know. But then, I saw it. A hand. Just the hand. Pale, thin, with long fingers. It reached out of the closet and grabbed the door frame. My blood went cold. I couldn't even speak. Jake looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear. I couldn't move. I just watched as the hand pulled the door open a little more, like it was about to come out. But then, it stopped. The door didn't open all the way. It just stayed there, half open, like it was waiting for something. And then, just like that, the hand disappeared back into the dark. We both sat there, too scared to say anything else. I didn't want to ask if he saw more than just the hand, because I didn't want to know. And honestly, I was afraid he'd say yes. That night, I didn't lock my door. I wanted to. Every instinct told me to. But I didn't. Something inside me was terrified of waking up to it being open again, knowing I had locked it. So I left it unlocked, hoping that if I left it open just a crack, whatever was messing with us would leave it alone. Big mistake. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't like before. It wasn't faint or distant. This was clear. It was right next to me. I shot up in bed, my heart racing, and there at the foot of my bed I saw a figure. It wasn't like the shadow we'd seen before. This was more solid, but still wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. It was tall, hunched over, with long arms that stretched down toward the floor. Its skin was grey, almost translucent, and its face. I couldn't see its face. It was like it didn't have one, just a smooth, blank surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. And then it spoke. But it wasn't words. It was more like a low, guttural whisper, a sound that made my skin crawl. And somehow, I understood what it was trying to say. Jeremiah. It said the name. The one we swore we wouldn't say. The one we'd been trying to forget. And as soon as it said it, I felt something in the room shift. The air grew colder, denser, and that thing at the foot of my bed, it moved. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I bolted out of bed, threw the door open, and ran into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I could still hear the whispering, faint now, but constant. Jeremiah, Jeremiah, Jeremiah. I was about to run for Matt and Jake's rooms when I noticed something in the hallway mirror. It was just for a split second, but I saw it. A figure, standing right behind me. I turned, my heart in my throat, but the hallway was empty. That night, we all stayed in the living room. None of us wanted to be alone. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, but we didn't have to. We all knew. It was getting stronger. Whatever this thing was, it was more than just a spirit. It was feeding off us, off the fear, off the name. We tried to act normal the next day, like everything was fine. We went through the motions, went to work, grabbed food, all while avoiding the one topic we couldn't escape. And then, around midnight, the door to the basement opened on its own. We'd never gone down there. None of us had even bothered to check it out when we moved in. But now, standing in the dark hallway, staring at the open door, I could feel something pulling us toward it, like whatever was happening in the house was connected to that basement. Matt, pale and visibly shaken, looked at us and said what we were all thinking. Whatever this is, it's down there. The basement door had never been opened, not once since we'd moved in. And yet, there it was, wide open, a yawning black hole in the middle of the hallway, as if it had been waiting for us. I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears, staring into the dark void beyond the doorway. I didn't want to go down there. None of us did. But deep down, I knew that if we didn't, this thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to stop. It wasn't just messing with us anymore. It was inviting us in. Matt, always the braver one, or maybe just the more reckless, was the first to move. "We've got to see what's down there," he muttered, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. Jake and I exchanged a glance, both of us knowing there was no way we could let him go alone. As much as I hated the idea of going down there, the thought of staying up here, waiting, seemed even worse. So, one by one, we stepped through the doorway and onto the stairs. The air immediately felt colder, thicker, like it was pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. The wooden stairs creaked under our weight, every step echoing in the pitch-black space below. The light from Matt's flashlight barely pierced the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. I could see the dust swirling in the beam, like no one had disturbed the air down there in years. Halfway down the stairs, I started hearing it again. The whispering. Faint at first, but growing louder with each step we took. I glanced over at Jake. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear, but he kept moving. None of us were willing to admit how terrified we were. Not yet. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the whispering stopped. Dead silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. The flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought we were about to be plunged into total darkness. But then it steadied. We were standing in a small, unfinished basement. Concrete floor, brick walls, nothing out of the ordinary, except for one thing. In the middle of the floor, there was a circle, drawn in what looked like old, faded chalk. And in the center of that circle was a symbol. I didn't recognize it, but just looking at it made my skin crawl. It was like it didn't belong here, like it was something ancient and wrong, something that had no place in this world. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Matt stepped closer, shining the flashlight on the symbol. "It's old, like really old." He crouched down, running his hand over the edges of the circle. "I think this was a summoning circle." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "For what?" Before Matt could answer, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, like the pressure had changed, but then we all felt it. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the corners of the room started to stretch, creeping toward us like living things. The whispering returned, louder now, clearer. It was coming from all around us, like voices layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't like the shadow we'd seen before. This was more real. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to defy logic. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. And its face, God, its face was wrong. It had no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin where a face should have been. We all froze, too terrified to move. The thing, whatever it was, stood just outside the circle, staring at us with its eyeless face. And then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed at Matt. "Jeremiah," it whispered. Matt gasped, stumbling backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The thing stepped forward again, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the fear radiating off of us. "Say the name again," it whispered, though it didn't have a mouth. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "No!" Jake shouted, grabbing Matt's arm and pulling him back toward the stairs. "Don't say it! Don't even think it!" But Matt was frozen. His eyes were wide, locked on the creature, his mouth trembling. I didn't mean to. Matt, we need to go," I whispered urgently, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But Matt didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the creature like he was in a trance. And then, the thing smiled. It didn't have a mouth, but somehow I could feel it. It was smiling at us, taunting us. In that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. This thing was something older, darker. It had been waiting for someone to call it. And we had. By saying the name, we'd given it permission to come through, to cross over. And now it wasn't going to leave. "Matt!" Jake screamed, shaking him. But it was too late. The creature lunged forward, its long arms stretching toward Matt. Before any of us could react, it wrapped its fingers around him and pulled him toward the circle. Matt didn't even scream. He just went limp, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if all the life had been drained out of him. I grabbed Jake and yanked him toward the stairs. "Run!" We bolted up the stairs, not looking back, the whispering growing louder and louder as we reached the top. I slammed the door shut behind us, locking it, as if that would do anything to stop whatever was down there. But we both knew the truth. The basement wasn't the source. It was just a gateway. We'd let something into the house. And now, Matt was gone. Jake and I didn't say anything for a long time after that. We sat in the living room, staring at the door to the basement, waiting for something to come through. But it never did. The house was quiet. Too quiet. A week passed. We didn't call the police. What would we even say? Matt just disappeared. It was like the house had swallowed him up. We tried to leave, to get as far away as we could, but no matter where we went, the whispering followed. It was always there, just at the edge of our hearing. Software persistent, reminding us of what we'd done. I haven't heard from Jake in days. He stopped responding to my calls and texts. I think he's gone too, but I'm too afraid to check his room. I'm afraid that if I do, I'll find the same thing I found in Matt's room this morning. The name, Jeremiah, written over and over again on the walls, in long, scratchy letters, like someone had been carving it into the plaster with their fingernails. And now I hear it, the knocking. It's coming from inside my walls.